Smith, and I'm the MC for today's event. I'm the National Field Director for the Conflict Coalition, and it's my pleasure today to tell you congratulations for making it to the final round of the Fiscal Challenge. By now you're pretty familiar with the rules. I won't go over every single one of them, other than to tell you we have two 15-minute segments. The first 15 minutes, I'll be timing you for both, showing you time cards and so forth. I will be pretty curt and stop you at the end of the first 15-minute segment, but during the Q&A, during that 15-minute segment, if you come to an end, I'll allow you to finish your thought if you push against the time there. So before we get started, if you'll please confirm for me your team number.
We are team 996.
996. Judges, this is team 996. Okay, please go ahead and get started when you're ready.
Welcome to Team 996's presentation for the 2024 Fiscal Challenge. Here we are in 2054, where we have achieved a debt-to-GDP ratio of 93.7%. But America wasn't always on a fiscally sustainable path. Let's travel back to 2024, where our predecessors switched gears and prioritized a more stable economic future. We'll start by looking at the state of the economy when Congress hit the brakes on our fiscally unsustainable trajectory.
In 2023, the United States collected $4.4 trillion in revenue, with around 50% coming from individual income taxes. However, the U.S. federal government spent $6.1 trillion, resulting in a deficit of $1.7 trillion in 2023. This spending includes $1.6 trillion on healthcare programs such as Medicare, $1.3 trillion on Social Security, and $800 billion on defense. This imbalance is reflected in the U.S. Government Accountability Office's audit, where severe weaknesses rendered them unable to issue an opinion.
Historically, the U.S. spent approximately $1.7 trillion in discretionary spending and $4.1 trillion in mandatory spending. In 2023, the U.S. spent about $663 billion in interest payments, which is a 40% increase over 2022.
The 2023 U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio was 99%, which the CBO projected would reach 171% of GDP by 2054. Higher debt levels meant that a larger portion of taxpayer dollars went towards interest payments rather than meeting public demands.
In June 2023, the federal government voted to suspend the debt ceiling into 2025. We do not believe future governments will have problems dealing with this issue, and have likewise factored this expectation into our projections. By embracing sustainable fiscal decisions starting in 2024, we safeguard present prosperity and propel America back to a future of economic resilience.
Our proposal both increases revenue and GDP while decreasing spending to achieve a sustainable debt-to-GDP ratio of 93.7% by 2054. Doing all of this at once is not feasible. Our proposal will phase in policies over the next 30 years to minimize disruptions while still achieving our revenue and productivity goals.
There is uncertainty in any policy rollout. As such, we have modeled the median, better, and worst case scenarios for each of our team's policies and aggregated them on the median, upper, and lower bounds on this graph.
First, we will travel back to 2024 and see the initial policies that were enacted to set us on a path of fiscal sustainability. Then, we will travel to 2034 and see what policies were phased in during the second wave. And finally, we will go to 2044 to see how the final stages played out.
The flux capacitor will track our policy impacts on the debt-to-GDP ratio, filling up as we approach a sustainable level of 95% over 30 years. During this period, pale blue represents decreased interest spending due to the debt's principal decreasing. Medium blue is decreased non-interest spending. Dark blue represents benefits due to fiscal GDP, and navy blue is revenue increases. The progress these changes make is powering us back to a sustainable fiscal future and is represented by the progress of the cog at the bottom of the screen.
Let's journey back to 2024, where we'll start with our first wave of policies that go into effect immediately. To encourage investment in more efficient, environmentally friendly processes, we institute a tax on greenhouse gas emissions at the CBO recommended rate of $25 per metric ton, increasing by an adjusted 2% annually. According to the CBO, this rate is high enough to meaningfully decrease emissions while minimizing overly distortionary effects.
Wait a second, won't this cause businesses to cut domestic production?
No. We address these concerns by allowing firms to reduce up to 100% of their tax liability by investing in environmentally friendly processes. Also, taxing global emissions of U.S. firms will close the offshoring loophole.
Over 30 years, a mix of revenue and GDP effects will decrease the debt-to-GDP ratio by 3.2 percentage points.
Currently, states determine what treatments are covered and who is eligible for Medicare benefits. To improve equity between states, we propose an overall cap on federal Medicare funding to states. Furthermore, let's raise Medicare Plan B premiums to go from covering 25 to 35% of the cost. This will lead to a $6.68 trillion decrease in spending over 30 years and a corresponding 11.1 percentage point decrease in the debt-to-GDP ratio.
In 2022, the U.S. population only grew by 0.38% due to record low birth rates in the COVID-19 pandemic. Meanwhile, almost a quarter of the current workforce is expected to retire over the next decade. These changing demographics are already being reflected in the current labor market, where there are currently 2.5 million more job openings to unemployed Americans. These labor shortages stunt productivity and diminish overall economic growth.
We can fill this labor market gap and increase productivity by raising U.S. immigration quotas by 1 percentage point per year relative to total employment. Our plan grants amnesty for over 500,000 active DACA recipients, increases the refugee quota by 10% each year with a cap, and offers green cards to all foreign-born graduates of U.S. universities and trade schools that find a job within 18 months after graduation.
But won't the influx of new low-income immigrants further strain the welfare system?
New low-skilled immigrants do increase the burden of federal welfare payments, but they also boost long-run demand and tax revenue. As described in a paper by Evans and Fitzgerald, refugees were found to pay $20,000 more in taxes than they received in benefits over 20 years, thus boosting long-run government revenue.
Well, what about the immigration processing infrastructure that's already overwhelmed?
We propose doubling border security spending from $25 billion to $50 billion for hiring additional border patrol agents, processing assistants, investing in border security technology, and anti-drug trafficking efforts. In all, immigration changes reduce the debt to GDP by 15.3 percentage points.
Well, given that the U.S. housing market has failed to keep up with increasing population and job growth, where will all these new immigrants live?
To address these supply-side issues, we propose banning single-family zoning in all core-based statistical areas with over 200,000 people, alongside banning minimum parking requirements across the U.S. This would lower the cost of housing by making it easier to build denser housing and by removing burdensome parking provisions, enabling households to move towards where they are more productive. According to a paper by Gerko and Glazer, unnecessary zoning costs restrict GDP by 2 percentage points. We project that our proposal will avoid half of this GDP restriction, leading to a $100 billion increase in GDP and a 1.6 percentage point decrease in the debt to GDP by 2054.
The SALT deduction disproportionately benefits wealthy taxpayers in regions with higher taxes. Abolishing the SALT deduction will increase government revenue by $2.79 trillion and lower the debt to GDP ratio by 5.2 percentage points over the next 30 years. Increasing taxes will decrease GDP by a total of $1 trillion over the same time period, and we've lowered our debt to GDP estimates to account for decreases in state and local spending.
This graph shows net household income in 2023 dollars on the x-axis, and the change in the average amount households at this income level pay in and receive from the government on the y-axis. This first decade, every American is on net receiving less from the government, reflecting the difficulties of transitioning to a more fiscally sustainable path.
Hop in, let's take a look at our second wave of policies that will phase in fully by 2034. A value-added tax, or VAT, is a consumption tax applied to the incremental increase in value of a good or service at each stage in its supply chain. We propose applying a 5% VAT to most goods and services on top of existing taxes. This will lead to a 17.3 percentage point reduction in debt to GDP from its proposed implementation in 2034.
This sounds like it will be a significant financial burden for low-income households.
Well, we purposely chose a consumption tax since it's less distortionary compared to changing corporate tax rates.
Furthermore, to offset the negative effects for low-income families, we pair this VAT with a negative income tax. Under our plan, households that make below a certain income threshold will now receive money from the government instead of paying that in income taxes.
How is this better than current welfare programs?
This is preferable to current welfare programs as it minimizes the effects of benefit cliffs. Under our program is designed so wealthy individuals pay more in taxes to supplement the income received by poorer Americans. Under our plan, we would lower the lowest tax bracket to negative 10% and the second lowest bracket to 5%, increasing the tax rate for the rest of the brackets up to 40%.
Households making less than $107,250 will actually pay less in income taxes, and those above this threshold will pay more. This leads to a $1.2 trillion increase in government revenue and a 2 percentage point decrease in the debt to GDP ratio by 2054.
Researchers Davis and Wolfram estimate that the privatization of nuclear power plants boosts their productivity by 10%, resulting in an output increase equal to $2.5 billion a year per reactor. Because many public reactors are owned by municipalities, we will incentivize their sales by forewarning that federal unclean energy subsidies could be withheld.
Accounting for a 5-year time period to sell off the nuclear power plants, we estimate that the privatization of America's remaining plants will boost GDP by $1.83 trillion and will decrease the debt to GDP ratio by 0.4 percentage points over 20 years. In addition, these output increases will grow our dependence on clean energy sources, decreasing CO2 emissions by 770 million tons per year.
Currently, 20% of hedge funds' profits are given to the fund manager as compensation but are taxed as capital gains. LIFO allows firms to deduct inventory at later rates, and lower of cost or market in some normal goods allows firms to incur losses, decreasing their taxable income. Advertising expenditures are currently fully expensed in the year of incidence, but provide benefits for longer periods. Updating these will increase revenue by $392 billion and decrease the debt to GDP ratio by 1.6 percentage points by 2054.
The Social Security Trust Fund is expected to become insolvent in 2041. Approximately 25% of households aged 65 or older depend on Social Security benefits for 90% of their income. To address this problem, we propose to phase in flattening Social Security payments to 150% of the federal poverty line and to immediately remove the cap on maximum earnings subject to the Social Security tax. To balance this, we will reduce the Social Security tax rate by 1 percentage point to 11.4%. In all proposals would help keep Social Security solvent while also lowering the debt to GDP by 7.9 percentage points.
This graph shows the cumulative effect of the policies from the past 2 decades in 2044 on net household income based on income level. The positive effects have started to become more salient in lower and middle income families.
We're almost back to the future. Let's take a look at the policies which take full effect in 2044. We propose a blanket cut of 10% to the defense budget, fully effective in 2044. This would be a broad reduction in military spending. Instead of determining specific programs to cut, military leaders would be empowered to allocate the new budget as they best see fit. In all, this would reduce spending by $3.6 trillion and the debt to GDP ratio by 5.1 percentage points.
Given current geopolitical tensions, is 2024 the right time to cut military spending?
2024 is an inappropriate time to reduce U.S. military spending. Thus, this policy's 20-year delay would decrease defense spending without jeopardizing global security, with the hope that current tensions will have simmered by 2044.
The United States does not provide public child care options and is the world's only wealthy country that does not offer paid parental leave to full-time employees. Thus, many parents leave the labor force to care for their children. This drag on labor force participation stunts productivity and hurts economic growth.
We propose offering 3 months of paid parental leave for all full-time employees, along with universal pre-K for children beginning at 3 months. Our policy would have a 7-year phase-in, giving time to build infrastructure to support the program. We estimate that these policies would bolster labor force participation and add $99 billion to GDP each year by 2044, while costing the federal government $15 billion per year. In all, they would reduce the debt to GDP ratio by 1 percentage point. Ultimately, a 20-year delay on this policy allows us to use previously generated revenues from our proposal, breaking the precedent of deficit-funded investments for America's future.
Welcome back to 2054. Today we enjoy the economic stability which was ensured by the policy changes that have been implemented over the past 30 years. We timed the implementation of these policies so that they work together to address some of America's most pressing challenges over the past 3 decades. In 2024, the United States had a significant labor shortage and faced demographic challenges that were projected to constrain our growth. Our immigration, housing, and tax policies increased labor force participation of current U.S. individuals and improved demographic trends.
Our policies also transitioned us to a more environmentally sustainable America. The emissions tax discouraged carbon-intensive investments. Remaining demand was met by the privatization of nuclear energy. By decreasing the regulatory burden on nuclear power plants, they were able to soak up much of the new investment and provide long-term, clean energy solutions for the U.S. economy.
Finally, the implementation of our negative income tax and universal pre-K programs have increased the overall well-being of lower and middle-income families, further boosting GDP and government revenue while equitably distributing the cost of ensuring our fiscal future.
This package appeals to both the left and the right sides of the aisle. Out of our 13 policies, 4 appeal mostly to the left, 4 appeal mostly to the right, and 5 are bipartisan solutions.
Together, our policy package drove down the national debt to GDP from a projected 171% in 2054 to a sustainable level of 93.7%. As the debt decreases, the reduction in interest was a major component of this path back to fiscal sustainability. We also achieved our goal through a good mix of revenue and GDP effects, setting us on a path toward a fiscally sustainable 93.7% debt to GDP ratio. Even accounting for the uncertainty in our policy effects, the worst case scenario would still significantly reduce the debt and put the U.S. on a more sustainable fiscal path.
By protecting our environment, reforming social programs, and equitably investing in structural change to support America's changing demographics, we have ensured that the U.S. economy won't break down, but will instead continue to accelerate into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Team 996. At this point, we will immediately transition into the Q&A. Which judge would like to ask the first question?
I'll go first. Let's start with Social Security. So there are a lot of policy levers you can pull to think about Social Security. You guys decided to go with a flat benefit, basically, and then a reduction in the payroll tax to kind of give a little sweetener. Why did you go that route as opposed to payroll tax increases, increasing the retirement age? Why a flat benefit?
Yeah, so the big reason for a flat benefit is this idea that currently a lot of seniors are living in poverty, even on Social Security. And that's really what this social safety net is for. So we're trying to keep seniors out of poverty so that they have this sort of safety net, they can retire and live comfortably. And that's why we're going for this flat benefit, to bring up the people who need it the most, while potentially balancing out some of the spending by taking away from people who need it the least. It's also important to note that we have a 10-year timeline, like this is in our second wave of policies. So we're going to be decreasing this tax rate and flattening these benefits over time and later, giving people in the higher income brackets time to invest in their retirement and make sure that they can plan for this and maintain their lifestyle accordingly.
It's also important to note that we are fixing a regressive hole in the Social Security tax by getting rid of the cap on maximum earnings subject to Social Security tax that disproportionately benefits wealthy Americans. And so by getting rid of that cap, we're creating a more progressive tax system, and those wealthier Americans are going to help finance these payments.
And that was my next follow-up question, which you probably just answered, but you have moving the cap for earnings over 250. This starts in 2034. So the next 10 years, the payroll tax cap would actually keep going up as long as there's inflation, so you might actually hit that
Right.
point regardless that you just remove it. Okay. Thank you.
How did you opt to model your interest savings at the end of the day? First of all, thank you for kind of breaking out your categories of savings there. But you have a pretty substantial amount of savings coming from interest with a lot of phase-ins. Could you just kind of talk about that?
Yeah, certainly. So the interest spending, how we modeled that is we took the projected interest rate that the United States is going to pay. We actually took those projections from the CBO in terms of back those out of their calculations in terms of what the US debt levels were going to be and what the interest payments were going to be. So we took that as kind of our baseline. And then from there we used that as our interest rate, but we decreased the deficit with these austerity measures, bringing back some of the spending, bringing in more revenue, increasing the GDP to bring in more revenue along those lines. We then saw that actually, since you reduced the deficit, you were reducing what you were paying in interest, and that's how that kind of went through the model, is we took that difference between what we were paying in interest in the CBO projections versus what you were paying in interest under our new projections with the lower deficit levels.
And we thought this was important to address because as the debt continues to balloon on our current trajectory, the money used to pay for interest spending is taking away from discretionary spending on things Americans truly care about, like healthcare, like infrastructure improvements. And so our whole policy as a whole is aimed at not just like putting the debt to GDP ratio at a sustainable level, but also tangibly benefiting like everyday Americans. And so by addressing for the decrease in interest spending, we're also accounting for the effect that that has on Congress and the way they make their budget.
Can you talk a little bit about your housing policies? It seemed to me that they relied on changes in zoning, which is not necessarily a federal government issue. What types of policies were you looking at that would, say, eliminate single-family zoning? How would that be achieved?
I think the main way that we are trying to achieve this is by focusing on like HUD funding from the government that they provide to states. And so we would think that like we would incentivize states to follow these kind of regulations by withdrawing that funding.
The other major issue with a lot of these zoning regulations is this whole not my backyard idea. So what we have is a lot of people actually support the idea of I want this more dense housing, more housing for people, housing prices are getting too high, just not in my neighborhood. So the idea is that it's very hard to pass these things on a local level. So what we're going to do is provide some federal level pressure with the HUD funding and then political cover to local leaders and mayors and state leaders to then say, hey, the federal government's making me do this. And everyone actually supports it on a national level, so it won't be as difficult for federal people to pass this. But on a state level, they then have some political cover to go ahead and pass these laws that are on net good for everyone.
It's an interesting question, because I was thinking the same thing too about the, DC is a great example of where you see this happening, right? Basically, Capitol Hill, they don't want to change the National Historic Preservation rules, they're not going to. You can see the equity fight between those who are higher income wanting to protect their properties, who might be willing to give up HUD housing because they don't get HUD funding. So it's such an interesting dynamic on whether or not the public choice problem would actually resonate here, that would actually work or not. So it's just an interesting idea. That's what I was wondering as well. I'm also curious about one of the policies you picked. Since you're going last, I can tell you the only group that brought up nuclear energy. So I'm curious, why?
We wanted to introduce an energy policy that complemented our carbon tax in order to set a precedent just that going forward, that not only does America want to be sustainable in our fiscal policy, but we also want to be sustainable in our energy production.
Furthermore, the nuclear power policy is more right-leaning, while we know that an emissions tax, even with the green investment credit, is more left-leaning, and we're thinking in terms of political feasibility and this package we wanting to appeal to both sides of the aisle.
Also, with our carbon tax, that's going to discourage certain carbon-intensive investments to be made, and that could lead to less energy for the United States. And so we wanted to create a policy that could replace some of that lost capacity, and we thought that nuclear energy was a good, clean, safe solution for that.
Tell me a little bit more about the decisions you guys made on what policies to phase in. You know, some policies you're phasing in, some policies you're not. That's, as someone who's kind of worked in Congress and policymaking, in fiscal stuff, we do think about phase-ins all the time. So just tell me a little bit more about why you chose what to phase in, when to phase in.
Yeah, so we kind of, when we were, as a whole, when we were looking at kind of what to include and stuff, we were thinking about, you know, in 2054, we have a sustainable debt to GDP level. What are the things that in the past we have done to get to this point? And so we think about like the most pressing challenges today and what sort of issues would have to be corrected. And so things like labor, housing, and social security. And so we have kind of put up like at the upfront the most pressing issues as seen in our labor through immigration and our housing policies. And then something like social security, we have kind of, it's like, I guess technically a little bit more hopeful, if you will. So we've like allowed that to be phased in a little bit later.
Furthermore, we wanted to kind of like distribute the effects of these kinds of things. So like Medicare was probably not going to be super popular amongst everyone. We don't want to pair Medicare and Social Security in the same period. And so we try to split it up so that there's no one hurting too badly in one period.
And additionally, there's just like logistical issues with some of these policies that need a longer time period to actually take effect. So take something like universal pre-K. This is something that is potentially a very big cost, and also you have a large shortage of educators right now. So we need 20 years to prepare for this, allow our immigration policies and some of our labor supply policies to take effect, in order to give us the ability to actually sustainably do these policies, not just fund it through more deficit spending.